I waited 6 years for Sonic Superstars release. Sonic the Hedgehog is my favorite franchise of all time, and Sonic Mania is my favorite game of all time. Period. Ever since I first played it back in 2017, I've been waiting for a sequel. It seemed inevitable with all the success and praise that Mania garnered from both fans and critics. However, it would take quite a long time for a follow-up to come out. In June of 2023, Sonic Superstars was announced, and as you could probably tell, I was a little excited about it. I am so excited, so excited, so excited. I'm so excited, so excited, so excited, so excited, super excited. Even though it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, getting an entirely original classic Sonic game that innovated on the formula had me ecstatic regardless. The graphics and art style looked great. The physics seemed almost one-to-one the same as the other classic games. The Emerald powers looked like an interesting new feature. The new character Trip was absolutely adorable. And oh god damn it, it's fucking Fang! When the game released on October 17th, I finally experienced the game I've been waiting for over half a decade. And it was good. Hi! Now, this isn't a full review, so I'm not going to get into my thoughts on the entire game in this video, but I will say that it's an enjoyable experience that's definitely worth adding to your collection if you're a fan of Sonic. However, there's one aspect of this game that, in my opinion, falls completely flat. Something that was never really all that noteworthy in previous classic Sonic games, but stands out in this one for all the wrong reasons: the boss battles. The boss battles with Superstars are, in my opinion, the weakest sections of the game by far, and they turn what would have been a great game into just a good one. The boss battles in classic Sonic were never really all that noteworthy, with the exception of final bosses, which were always almost always an epic conclusion to the game. But there are a few key design differences in Superstars that I think make most of the bosses significantly worse than in previous games. It took me a while to figure out what they are exactly, but I think I can boil it down to one word: packing. I mean pacing. Essentially, the boss fights in Superstars completely ruin the pacing of the game by bringing the high-speed action to a screeching halt. The fights take forever, they aren't consistently engaging, and they can't seem to decide if they want to be fully classic or something entirely new. They try to do both and accomplish neither. Rather than being brief but satisfying challenges the player can engage with however they want, they're just huge, repetitive time wasters that are a chore to get through. To fully understand what I mean, let's explore pacing and how it's utilized in the world of classic Sonic.
The Fitness Gram Pacer test is a multi-stage aerobic capacity test that progressively gets more difficult as it continues.
The key aspect to Sonic boss battles, and really Sonic games in general, is pacing. Now, pacing is a pretty broad subject that can be applied in several ways, but generally it refers to how a piece of media conveys information to you. Usually it's in reference to the pacing of a story in a movie or book. But for video games, pacing is a little different. Rather than just being about story information, pacing in video games is also about revealing gameplay aspects in a way that feels natural and not overwhelming or monotonous. Something a lot of game designers strive for is to put the player in what's called a flow state, where a player is fully immersed in a game without being bored or stressed. This is most commonly shown as a balance between player skill and game challenge. Good pacing is key when trying to achieve this flow state. It's important to keep giving the player new challenges to keep them engaged, but it's also equally important to not overwhelm them with too many new things at once so they don't feel stressed. This balancing act is difficult, but games that achieve it are often really satisfying to play. Overcoming challenges that were naturally introduced and expanded on feels great, and will motivate a player to keep playing. Things like massive difficulty spikes or long stretches of having to fight the same enemies or obstacles are absolute pace breakers that disrupt a player's rhythm and take them out of the experience. Thinking things like, when is this going to be over? Or, oh, I'm so tired of this. For our purposes, this kind of pacing is what matters. And it's here where we find a huge reason why classic Sonic games are held in such high regard, because behind all the high-speed action and bright colors, Sonic Team proved that they understood the importance of good pacing in games and how it can significantly impact a player's experience playing their games. To put it simply, they understood.
P.O.P. That's the P.O.P.
Pacing. You see, classic Sonic games have an interesting kind of pacing that I like to call player-catered pacing, or PCP. You see, classic Sonic games have an interesting kind of pacing that I like to call player optimized pacing, or POP, which basically means that the pacing of the game is almost entirely dictated by the player's competency and preferences. Essentially, these games were designed to cater to any player and encourage them to play however they want. They're incentivized to explore, to experiment, to gain knowledge of the physics and stage layouts. Because stages are usually pretty open and have things like multiple pathways and hidden treasures, a player can find their ideal route through each stage. They'll learn how to avoid oncoming hazards with ease. They'll know where to find things like extra lives or power-ups. Eventually, they'll become so skilled that they'll be able to complete stages in a seamless flow of actions and movements that result in an extremely satisfying experience. The unique factor that ties all of this together is Sonic's speed, of course. The most skilled of players will be able to build and maintain top speeds for large sections of stages, potentially even entire stages, completing them faster and faster. The timer also encourages this, motivating players to find their favorite routes, then figure out how to complete them faster by using the physics and stage layouts to their advantage. These are the building blocks that give the classic games great pacing, since a player can complete stages however they see fit, then optimize their strategies to reach the end of stages faster and faster with seamless gameplay flow. The high speeds that Sonic can reach add to this experience by giving players an exciting rush when they figure out how to maintain them. The only notable restriction on players is the 10-minute time limit that was put in place in the older games, which is very generous and won't usually have much of an impact on gameplay. This was how these games became so popular and why they're so beloved by fans to this day. Sonic Superstars also does this, for the most part. As far as the actual stages go, I don't have a lot of complaints. These follow the same formula that the previous games do. Multiple pathways, ways to optimize for both speed and exploration, all that good stuff. Some were a little more frustrating or mediocre than others, but they still obey the classic Sonic philosophy. So they're still a good time. A great time, usually. But then we have the boss battles. Okay, so Sonic Superstars bosses have a few big problems. First off, these battles are just way too long. And don't just take my word for it. I have receipts, baby! I watched these two videos, shout out to Dark Lord Chaos, and recorded how long every boss battle took in every classic Sonic game, and then put them all on a line graph, and if we take a look, we can see—
Oh my goodness! Squidward!
So yeah, for some godforsaken reason, they decided that these boss fights should be insanely long. If we look down here at the battles from previous games, the vast majority of fights are less than a minute long, maybe even less than 30 seconds, and a few even under 10 seconds. And these are both final bosses, so they kinda warrant being longer than typical fights anyway. Sonic Superstars boss fights, on the other hand, are basically in their own stratosphere. The majority of fights take over a minute, with several over 2 minutes. These four atrocities take over 3, 5, 6, and 7 minutes respectively to complete. That is absurd. That 7-minute long fight is the true final boss versus this giant dragon thing that shows up basically out of nowhere with almost no buildup. Where did this thing come from? This monstrosity takes forever to beat. I don't even think the fight itself is terrible. It's pretty challenging, but not unfair, and the constant hunt for rings means there's always something to do. But the sheer length of it makes it exhausting to get through. Nothing was more deflating than getting right to the end of the fight only to screw up on this brand new mechanic the game throws at you out of nowhere and die and have to do the whole fight over again. Let's compare this with another Supersonic boss, specifically the true final boss of Sonic 3 and Knuckles in the Doomsday Zone. As you can see, this boss is also fairly long in comparison to its peers in the old classic games. However, it still only clocks in at a bit over 2 minutes, miles below the Superstars final boss. This is just the right amount of time, in my opinion. Long enough to make the boss feel climactic, but not so long that it becomes a test of endurance just to get through it. This means that 1, it takes less time to win, duh, and 2, losing doesn't waste nearly as much time. It also helps that the boss doesn't introduce a brand new mechanic right at the end of the fight that's likely to get players killed and have to start the entire 7-minute ordeal all over again. And remember, there are 4 bosses in Superstars that are at least a full minute longer than the final boss of Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Why? What's the point? Okay, so that's pretty ridiculous, but let's just hold on for a second. Just because a fight is longer doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, right? I mean, as long as the fight is interesting and engages the player consistently, then it's not that big of a deal. Personally, I'd argue that these 4 are still way too long on their own, but still, just the fact that the battles are long isn't the end of the world. But see, this leads into the second problem. In my opinion, most of these boss fights are not consistently engaging, and that's because they still use the design philosophy of classic Sonic when it comes to boss behavior, which is to say, they have extremely simple attack patterns that hardly change at all throughout the fight. Bosses do have phases, but usually the only thing that changes between them is that they do the exact same attacks, just with a slight increase in difficulty. Like, they'll shoot a few more missiles at once, or move an attack a little bit faster, things like that. Rarely, if ever, is there actually something new as you progress. And if you're gonna have boss fights this long, you need to throw new things at the player consistently. Otherwise, the boss will inevitably feel boring and monotonous. I want to bring attention to by far the worst boss fight in the entire game, in my opinion, the final boss in Trip's story, Fang. God, this fight sucks so much. Most of these attacks are stupidly simple and easy to avoid for a final boss. Like, let's take a look at the first phase. Here's every attack. First, 2 barrages of missiles that can easily be dodged by simply standing still and jumping at the right time. A charge attack that is very clearly telegraphed and can be easily avoided by moving to the left or right. And finally, a third attack where Fang shoots a bunch of slowly rotating lasers that can be safely navigated under with good timing. And the timing window is pretty generous. These attacks are not befitting of a final boss. They're so simple that you could easily put this boss in an early game zone and it would feel just as appropriate. It's that simple. But I guess the devs realized that the fight was too brain dead because they decided to make these lasers instant kills. They couldn't be bothered to make an actually genuinely exciting and difficult boss, so they just added these frustrating buzz kills to artificially increase the difficulty. If these weren't instant kills, this boss would not be threatening in the slightest. The only source of tension comes from the fact that a single mistake means death. And by the way, the second phase also has an instant kill move, but at least there it's a more interesting attack and the rest of the phase is generally more difficult, but that doesn't make it any less deflating when you get so far only for a single mistake to cost you the entire fight and have to start the entire 6-minute long battle all over again. Not to mention this stupid headbutt attack that is barely telegraphed and destroys the platform you're standing on, basically making it another one-hit kill move. Ugh, what a terrible boss! Fuck you, Fang! If you're familiar with classic Sonic, then that description might make you think of a certain other boss fight where one mistake means instant death. That boss being the Death Egg Robot from Sonic 2, the final boss from that game. And it's true, the extreme difficulty and tension in this fight is largely due to the fact that just one mistimed attack or mistaken positioning means dying and starting the whole level over again. In fact, you might be able to argue that it's worse here, because dying not only means having to start this fight over again, but also having to fight the previous boss, Mecha Sonic, again as well. However, I think the context is different. The Death Egg Robot and Mecha Sonic kill you in one hit because the level gives you no rings. This makes the threat of instant death feel more natural, and it's also constant. Having no rings means that any mistake at any time will almost certainly result in a death. The Fang attacks are instant kills because the developers decided to make them instant kills. No other reason. The boss isn't difficult because any mistake means death. They're difficult because sometimes there are attacks that will just kill you. It's not consistent. It's kind of hard to explain, but that change in context just makes it feel less natural than it does in Sonic 2. This lack of variation in attack patterns, combined with the sheer amount of time it takes to beat the bosses, makes the fights anything but exciting. You do nothing but dodge the same attack patterns over and over with slight variation for several minutes until you can finally win. However, that's not even the end of it, because there is one more ingredient that we haven't talked about yet, and it is, in my opinion, the biggest problem of all, and the thing that makes these boss fights completely unbearable. The biggest problem with these fights is that they try to maintain this classic formula while also breaking it. In the other classic games, bosses were able to be attacked basically at any time. All you had to do was jump into the boss at the right time to damage it. This meant that the only thing between you and winning was your own ability to attack the boss. There was technically no limit to how many hits you could get at once, so a skilled player could defeat bosses really quickly by getting a lot of hits in at every opportunity. A consequence of this system is that bosses can sometimes be trivial, detracting from the seriousness and making them feel like no threat at all. I mean, just look at this. It's kind of pathetic. Robotnik, you're pathetic. It's hard to take a boss seriously when you can beat them in under 10 seconds. I could understand why some people wouldn't like that, but I think the feeling of satisfaction that comes with finding ways to beat the bosses in this short amount of time makes it worth it, and is consistent with the POP that we talked about earlier. I value the gameplay experience a lot, so I think this potential loss of tension or climax is a worthy sacrifice for the sake of maintaining the player's control. To show what I mean, let's take a look at the first boss in Sonic Mania, the DD Wrecker. This boss has two segments, both of which need to be hit 3 times in order to destroy them. At any point, the wreckers will either be safe to hit or covered in spikes and damage you on contact. The important thing to note here is, even if a wrecker is hazardous, it can still be damaged. So, there are 2 main ways to beat this boss. Method 1. Avoid touching the wreckers when they're spiked and attack them whenever they're vulnerable. This is most likely what the developers intended. If executed well, this will allow you to preserve your rings and will typically take around 30 seconds to complete. Method 2. Take damage on purpose and use your invincibility frames to damage a wrecker no matter if it's hazardous or not. This is much faster and can end the fight in around 10 or 15 seconds at the cost of most or all of your rings.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
See? The pacing of the battle is entirely dictated by the playstyle you want to do. Whether you want to play it safe and hold on to your rings, or you want to be aggressive and end the battle as fast as possible, the process is still engaging consistently, and even if you choose to play it safe, the battle still doesn't take very long. Think of it like a self-checkout aisle at a grocery store. You're in complete control of the process there. You can scan your items as fast or slow as you want, and you can bag them however you want. You could take your time making sure everything goes smoothly, ensuring every item is scanned properly and bagged in a way that protects them from any damage. Or you can go really fast and scan things haphazardly and bag them in no particular order. Sure, you might risk forgetting to scan something and accidentally shoplift a chocolate bar, or maybe you bag things incorrectly and damage an item in the process, like putting a gallon of milk on top of a loaf of bread and ruining it forever. But hey, that's your choice, and you're free to make it. Now, not every battle is this simple or even designed the same way, but generally this is the framework that most classic Sonic battles are built on, and it works pretty well. Sonic Superstars decides to take this formula and chuck it out the fucking window! For a large portion of bosses in this game, the boss lets you hit them exactly 1 time. Then they become invulnerable and move to the background where you can't hit them for long stretches of time, throwing more basic ass attack patterns at you until they decide to move back in where you can land 1 more hit and then you have to do it all again. The pattern resets, they perform the same attacks with some slight variation, you hit them once again, repeat again, do this for a million years until they finally decide to go down. Holy shit, this is so agonizing. The worst offender of this is the Act 2 boss in Golden Capital, once again against Fang. This fight is over 3 minutes long, and the vast majority of that time is just moving around, dodging extremely basic hazards and attacks until you get the chance to hit him 1 time, and then you have to do it all again. There are some times when you have to wait close to an entire minute before you get another attack opportunity, and this design is all over the place in this game. This design forces the player to be subject to the game's pace, rather than being able to decide it for themselves. Now boss battles have a hard limit on how much they can be optimized, because battles are filled with sequences where dealing damage is impossible. If the old classic boss fights were like a self-checkout aisle, these fights are like a normal checkout aisle with a 16-year-old newbie who's only been working there for 2 weeks but thinks they're an expert. They scan things so unbearably slowly and take forever to decide how to bag them. When they pick up the produce you're buying, they pull out the big book with all the item codes in it and they spend like 5 minutes flipping back and forth looking for the cucumbers. And you can see that they've passed over it like 5 times. But when you try to point it out, they just hold their hand up and go, excuse me, I think I know what I'm doing, before going back to endlessly searching, and you just want to go home, and why won't they just let me do it? I want to get out of this hell! This can be mitigated somewhat by good use of the new emerald powers, by letting you attack the boss earlier without having to wait as long. The final boss in normal story mode does this pretty well. The second phase is technically always vulnerable, except right after you hit them, so you can land some extra hits with Avatar or Bullet, potentially ending the fight faster. However, this is not usually the case. Like I mentioned before, there are long stretches of time where the boss is in the background. When they're back there, they can't be damaged at all, no matter what you do. This just adds needless padding to the fights and makes them longer for no good reason. All of this destroys any sort of good pace or momentum the player might be feeling during the normal stages because it takes away nearly all of their agency. Now, instead of a fight being a test of player skill and decision making, it just becomes a waiting game. Wait until you can hit the boss, and then hit it, and then repeat. Do this over and over until you win. This is the biggest problem with Sonic Superstars, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it significantly worsens the experience of playing the game for me. In Sonic Superstars, boss battles do nothing except take the wind out of my sails by forcing me to play at the game's pace rather than my own. What were once satisfying conclusions to zones are now just frustrating slogs that I have to force my way through in order to get back to having fun. Sonic boss battles used to be simple yet satisfying challenges, but now they've been reduced to boring, frustrating slogs. Okay, alright, let me calm down for a second. I know this may seem kinda trivial, and I'm getting too worked up over it, but you gotta understand, this is not the first time something like this has happened. This is simply the latest of many examples of Sonic Team taking something that was perfectly fine and changing it for no good reason. It's happened over and over and over again, and every time I grow more and more tired of it. Sonic Team, please, just stop trying to fix what isn't broken. These things were perfectly fine the way they were. You did not have to mess with them like this. I also want to make clear that what I've shown here isn't universal, neither the good nor the bad. The old classic games have some bosses that I consider to be long time wasters, and Superstars has a few bosses that I think are pretty fun and unique, or at least decent. The one fight in Superstars that I'd say approaches a similar level of quality to the classic games is the boss of Golden Capital Act 1. This, giant piggy bank thing. Hear me out. If we look at the chart from earlier, we can see that this is the shortest fight in the game by far. Its attack pattern is extremely simple, but the short length makes this acceptable. The boss is almost always vulnerable to your attacks, and there are multiple ways to damage it. There are a few gimmicks, such as the fact that you have to fight it with no rings, and the weird gravity of the room that adds some challenge and makes the fight feel unique while still being fun. This is the one fight in the game that I'd say brings the classic Sonic boss fight into this game's style well, without sacrificing the strengths of the original formula. But of course, this is an exception. The majority of boss fights in Superstars are how I've described them: long, boring, and sometimes painful. The question I asked over and over again while thinking about this and working on this video was, why? Why did Sonic Team design the bosses this way instead of just keeping what already worked? And I think what it boils down to is an identity crisis. Sonic Team wanted to make a classic Sonic game, but with modern design aspects. This is why bosses have cutscenes, why the player can't simply attack them whenever they want, why they take so much longer to beat. These are things that the 3D Sonic games have been doing for a long time, and I think that Sonic Team was trying to insert those modern features into this old formula in an attempt to make it feel more modern. But they didn't fully commit. See, Even though the bosses in 3D games take longer and have times of invulnerability, they have more variation and complexity in their behaviors and attack patterns to justify these changes. But this aspect was not inherited by Superstars. Of all the things they changed, the behavior of bosses is still basically the same. The attack patterns are simple, and bosses hardly change throughout the fights. Mixing the two styles together like this resulted in boring, dragged-out fights that don't feel climactic like modern bosses, but also aren't fun like the classic bosses. They tried to create a new formula that achieves both, but they ended up creating one that does neither. To this end, I would offer Sonic Team a word of advice.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
In conclusion, play Mania instead. It has many things that I prefer over Superstars. Better music, better visuals, more fun level design, and of course, the boss battles are just way better in my opinion. The Mania team understood what made classic fights good and committed to the classic formula wholeheartedly, making fights that are short and sweet. I never feel like bosses are wasting my time because I can fight them however I want, just like the old games. It's not even that I think that most of them are anything special, it's just they're not noticeably bad like they are in Superstars. Mania is just the far better game, and these boss fights are a big reason why. Sonic Superstars is not a bad game, far from it, but these boss fights have turned what could have been a great game into just a good one. I suppose that's still a net positive, but it's frustrating to see such a simple change rob this game of its full potential. I hope that the team learns from this, and the next game offers a more refined experience that doesn't waste my fucking time. God damn it, Fang, just get over here so I can kill you! And that's the end of the video. That's the end. I hope you enjoyed my descent into madness. This is my first time making like a scripted video like this. Like, I guess you'd call it a video essay, so I really hope you enjoyed it. I plan to make more stuff like this in the future, so if you have any thoughts or suggestions or criticisms or just anything really, just please leave it in the comment section below or come to the Discord server, wink wink nudge nudge, and let me know what you thought of it there. Just want to take this time to give a couple shout outs here. First off, shout out to Dark Lord Chaos again for those videos covering all the boss battles, because I used them to make that beautiful chart. Put that chart up on screen again, that beautiful, wonderful chart. Shout out also to Channel Pup. A couple months ago, they released a video about this exact topic, going over a lot of the same points that I do. I promise I'm not ripping them off. I wrote the script for this video, the initial script for this video, like last year, basically, I think. So I promise this isn't just a rehash of their video. So go check out their video. It's really good. It's a lot more like laid back than mine, you know. It's mine, I get pretty heated, but his is pretty chill. So if you're into that sort of thing, then I recommend his video. It's really good. Next, shout out to my good buddies Reizo and Ranni from the Jobcast. They were a huge help in the making of this video. They helped look over my script and make the thumbnail and all this good stuff. So this video probably wouldn't have gotten released if it weren't for them. So shout out to those guys. Really appreciate that. And then finally, one more shout out to my buddy Ben, because he offered to lend me his audio and video equipment to record the live action bits, like the camera bits, but we just couldn't schedule it to work out, so I ended up just doing it on my own. But still, shout out to him. Thank you so much for offering. I hope we can work it out next time and actually do it. So thanks. And I guess that's it. So thanks again for watching, guys, and I will catch you in the next video. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm trying to reach 100 subs by the end of the year, so subscribe please. Thanks. Okay, bye.